This is House Planning Help episode 49. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in creating a better home, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century, and I want to complete my own project before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, I chat with David Rudlin from Urbed about collective custom build. So, quite an exciting time for me at the moment, because in the last episode I mentioned about the Kickstarter project that I was about to launch. Well, it's been accepted by Kickstarter and they now say you can go in your own time. It's a question of pressing the big green button, and I've just been thinking, when should I do that? What I would like to do first of all is to create a bit of build up, get in touch with a few of my friends, just so when we launch, we can launch with a bang, hopefully. So if you haven't heard much about my project, it's going to be a documentary on air tightness, but almost told through the work of Paul Jennings, the air leakage specialist, and I'll be going out with him to various projects and we'll be checking the air tightness of properties. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting. I hope you like the sound of it too and can get on board with that. I will be doing a special podcast on the launch day, which is the 1st of May. But in the meantime, I met this guy called Anthony D'Souza, who runs Crowdfunding Focus magazine. And he gave me this really good tip that in a 30-day campaign, if you can reach 30% of the target within the first 2 days, then the momentum is likely to carry you on the rest of the way. So that's certainly what I've got in my mind. What I'd like for you today, if you want to find out more information, I've set up what's called a pre-fundia page. That gives you the details and allows you to find out more about what I'm doing, so that when we get closer, it will all be second nature. You'll know where I'm going with this. So please check that out. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, which are at houseplanninghelp.com/49 for this episode. Today's podcast was inspired by a question Sam Brown sent in a little while ago, and the topic was collective custom build. To be honest, I've struggled to answer this question. However, I was at EcoBuild a month or so back having a coffee with Paul Tester, and he said, well, why don't you try speaking to David Rudlin from Urbed? So I thought, well, why not? He's experienced, he's a big supporter of collective custom build, and he's also been out to Almere. It's a development that we talked about a couple of times, and you'll hear more on it in this interview as well. I started by asking David to tell me a little bit about himself.
Okay, well, I'm an urban planner. I have spent the last 25 years, longer than I care to think about, working on urban housing. Started off setting up my own housing cooperative with a group of friends, and that's what got me into this. And so, ways in which communities can be empowered to get involved in their own housing and neighbourhoods is what really drives us forward, really.
You've actually said the word housing cooperative, which is definitely another thing on my hit list there. But I think we're going to skirt that for today, because there's an interesting topic of collective custom build. And I'm not sure how long this will take to go through. Maybe we'll end up coming back round to cooperative housing. But in terms of collective custom build, where do things start? What is it? You might need to start with custom build before you move on.
Okay, well, let's start with custom build. So custom build is the process by which people can choose their own home before it's built. So self-build, you buy a plot and you engage an architect and you get a design, or you design it yourself, and then you build it yourself out of your own materials. Custom build is different in that you choose a plot, you find a plot, and then you go and find a manufacturer who creates those houses. You buy one of those houses and they build it for you on the plot. Collective custom build, which is sort of a hybrid of the two really, is where a group of people come together and they buy a plot of land and they either buy existing houses which are manufactured to build in that house, or more often they engage an architect and they create a design collectively for the site, which they then jointly fund, jointly build, and it's created for them. So it's people coming together to choose an architect and to build their own. A collective custom build is normally a group of flats. It's not normally individual houses, it's normally an apartment block.
But it can be houses in certain situations. So I suppose when?
It can be. I mean, these things all start to merge into one. So the custom build movement comes from Holland. So if you go to Almere Newtown in Holland, there's a whole section which has been put over to custom build. And when you go around Almere, there's plots which are people who have put their individual houses on, and there are apartment blocks which have been done by groups of people. And in Germany, it's called Baugruppen, which is the same sort of thing. So the crossover between this and self-build becomes very blurred. So I was at a site in Bristol a few weeks ago where a group of people had come together, bought an old scaffolding depot, separated out the plots, and then they'd essentially done self-build, or some of them have bought kit houses to go onto it. So that sort of group custom build with individual houses. In other cases, you get people who just have an architect and it's entirely bespoke for that site, designed by that architect. So in a sense, it's the community being the client for it.
We're talking about a collective, so how do we get into this collective?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning a housing cooperative, which I did back in whenever it was. We were started on it in 1986, and it finally was opened in 1996. That essentially was group custom build. It's a scheme in Hume, an acre of land in the middle of Hume. It's now called the Yellow Bricks. If anyone knows Manchester, they'll know the Yellow Bricks. And a group of about 40 people came together, formed a housing cooperative, managed to get land allocated. You say that, it's actually incredibly difficult to get that land allocated from the council. Got planning permission, engaged an architect. The architect worked with the housing cooperative to design what eventually turned out to be 75 flats, along with a theatre and a cafe and a workspace and various other things, and they were occupied in 96. So that really was group custom build, but it was for rent. So the thing that make it a housing cooperative means it's for rent. Now, most modern group custom build is exactly the same process, but it's for sale. So people are getting a mortgage and they're putting their mortgage into the group, and they're getting, in return for it, they're getting ownership of the apartment which comes out of it.
What are the benefits and what are the downsides? Why would we be going into this over just doing it ourselves?
Well, the benefits of doing it as a group as opposed to individual is the one side of things. The benefits of doing this as a custom build as opposed to just going and buying a flat that someone else has built already. The thing about doing it as a group, as I found with a housing cooperative, is that you make very good friends. That you end up with an instant community when you move in. So you get to know these people really well, you work with them over a number of years, and you either hate them or they're really good friends, one or the other. It can go both ways. And so it's a very fulfilling collective process to build something with a group of people. The advantage of doing it over just going to buy a flat somewhere else is that you get to design your own house. And, normally you only have to be pretty rich to be able to design your own house, and to be in a situation where you can work with a group of people, design a flat to suit your needs, put all those quirky things in that you'd never find in a major house builder house, and you've got somewhere which is tailored to what you want. So you can have something much more interesting and bespoke and quirky than you might do if you bought it from Barrett's or whoever.
Is this really about unlocking the land potential?
Well, in the UK in particular, the land is always the difficult bit because land's really expensive. I mean, it's twice as expensive in the UK as it would be in Holland to buy the same piece of land, and that's because there's all sorts of complicated reasons to do with our planning process why that is. But yeah, if you can get hold of the land, then by getting planning permission for housing on land makes it incredibly valuable. So an acre of land can go from a few £1,000 with, if it's got a farming consent on it, to as much as £1 million with a consent. And so if you can get hold of the land, and we're working with a couple of groups at the moment who have got access to land through various means, then you can generate value by getting a consent on it for housing. And if you're doing so collectively, then you can do interesting things with that. You can actually create something interesting with the value as opposed to someone running off with it as profit.
Well, that's what I was thinking, that for one person finding a plot, you are limited in certain ways. Yeah. So coming together has an advantage. Are there any other things that we should think about?
Other things that we should think about? I think you need to think about how you want to live together as a community.
So this has long-ranging impacts. It's not just about the build.
It is, yeah, because I think it's about how you live. I mean, if you've got kids, how you want your kids to live, right? Where you want your kids to play, how you want them to grow up, how do you want them to relate to other people and so on. Certainly the housing cooperative that I was involved in, we put a lot of focus on the middle courtyard, a garden courtyard. It now opened almost 20 years ago, and so there are kids who are now young adults who spent their childhood playing in this courtyard, and you talk to these people and say that their childhood was very different because of it. So the way that you want to live, you can go further than this. I mean, there are various versions of this. For example, co-housing. Now, co-housing is a number of things. And one of them is a tenure. which we might talk about in a second. But another part of that is a way of living. For example, in a big scheme, once a month, you have to spend the day cooking for all your fellow community members. The advantage of that is that all the other days of the month you don't have to cook at all. You have a meal cooked for you by someone else. So, and you have common rooms, you have like a shared flat and so on, which you can have relations to stay. And so co-housing is an interesting extension of what people do with custom build.
Now, that's interesting to me too, having been to Lancaster co-housing. So I've got an overview of what this is, but I had no idea that there were any links in collective custom build. Would that be then a case of collective custom? I'm perhaps confusing my terms here, but is that an example of it as well, or has it then become co-housing?
Well, co-housing is a way of living in a tenure. So if you get involved in a collective custom build group, and you have to have a special mortgage that you can draw down as the thing is built. Co-housing in the Danish sense, or what's in America is called a condominium, which is a similar sort of thing, you actually own a share in the company that owns the building. It's almost the same thing. It's got the same value, but as the building's value goes up, your share goes up. But actually what you do is you own a share in the building, and therefore the building is owned collectively, even though you have a stake in it, which is equivalent to your apartments. And that's a particular type of tenure, which actually suits very well custom build. And so these things, to be honest, you can't really draw lines between them. You know, the process of building, the process of designing, the process of tenure which comes from that, they're all sort of linked together. And when you're doing this, you need to make choices about each of those things that you're going to do.
Is this a lengthy process then? If we were talking about one person, it would take 2-3 years sometimes. But when we've got a collective custom build, we have to be prepared that this is going to take a while, or are we just talking about mass amounts of people on site?
Well, from my perspective, it took ages. And that was because we were doing it on our own, looking for land on our own. 10 years it took us from the initial meeting in my flat where we said, wouldn't this be a brilliant idea, to actually the thing being opened, was 10 years. It was an enjoyable 10 years, but it was also an exhausting 10 years. Now, if you find a developer, and there are a couple in the UK now who are starting to think about this, who are interested in promoting custom build, then that cuts out a lot of the complication, because the developer will have sites already allocated for this and are looking for groups of people to come together to take those sites forward. So we're working for a developer at the moment called Igloo, who are looking at a number of sites across the country, which would include both normal custom build and collective custom build. And so talking to Igloo, if they're developing in an area where you're interested in living, then that might be a way of shortcutting the process, because they can provide a site, they can provide a framework into which, for example, they will be getting planning permission for the whole site. So that makes it easier for you to get planning permission for your bit of it, because you're part of a bigger scheme. And
does that mean then that we're set up and ready to go for that? I sometimes get confused by this term, or is it just the same as, because you're building things as a package and just tweaking it, aren't you? And I know that in parts of Germany, they sometimes have these villages that show you all the different variations that you can have.
So custom build as a process in Holland, you go into your plot shop, it's called a plot shop, which is like a sales office, and you've got a big map on the wall with all the plots, all the sites where the housing can be built. And someone will have stickers on them, which means they've already been bought or reserved or whatever. So you find one that's not been reserved, which is where you want to live, size you want, relationship to the housing and schools. You say, I'd like that one. So you put your name down for that, you pay a deposit on that plot. And then you go to another part of the office, and you've got this big book full of house types. And that will give you, 10 or so manufacturers who are producing houses which are suitable for the plot that you've just put a deposit on. You choose the one you like, you choose the house type that you like, the builder. You then go and work with that builder and you'll customise your house. It's where the custom build bit comes in. So, I'd like 3 bedrooms, I'd like it to be super energy efficient, I'd like it to have a grass roof or whatever. And whatever that manufacturer is able to do. The manufacturer then says, that's the house you want, that'll cost you this much. You sign a deal, and then the manufacturer then builds it on the site for you, and then a year later it's ready to move in. Now, some group custom build can use the same process, because you'll have manufacturers who can build blocks of apartments. So they've got stuff, so your group does the same thing. You choose your plot, I want this plot for 12 apartments, there's 12 families or whatever involved in the group. You collectively choose your manufacturer designs it, customises all the flats for you, you argue who's living on the penthouse and all that sort of stuff, agree it, get the price, they'll build it for you and so on. So that is very similar, but actually what it tends to happen is most group custom build people end up not being able to make the model fit their needs, and so they end up either customising it so much that you'd hardly recognise it from the original version, or getting an architect to design it from scratch.
Are you saying that people are being picky about what they do? We're not almost trained into this way of doing it. Is that a way of explaining it or not?
I'm not sure that's quite true. I think that the individual house market is much more developed. There's much more choice in the individual house market than there is in the apartment market. And so certainly in Holland, it appeared that most of the apartments had been designed from scratch with an architect, albeit with a system. You can buy systems, so a steel system or a prefabricated system to build it out of. So you're not designing every window and every wall and so on. You've got kits of bits that you can use. But it seemed to us that most of it then were being bespoke designed, which of course means they're not really custom built, because custom build implies that you're using a sort of pre-designed set of modules, and a lot of group custom build actually ends up not really being custom build.
I do love the way that I feel that we're floating through some terms here. So let me bring it back to collective custom build for a moment. And what will be the biggest challenge if you go down this route, you want to build this way?
Well, I mean, imagine the challenge that you have when you want to buy your own house. Just, you've got to get a mortgage, you've got to get a deposit together for it, you've got to... Okay, that's already difficult. You then want to build your own house, and you've got to get a mortgage for something that doesn't yet exist, and so you have to get a special mortgage which allows you to draw down money before the thing's complete. If you're doing that with 12 other families, then you're multiplying that complication. Can every family get their deposit together? Although there is all the groups I've known over the years, that's the difficult bit, that halfway through somebody loses their job or whatever, and that mortgage can't happen, and what happens to the half-finished house that someone's already put a deposit down on and so on. So these things are what become complicated. And also I've had other situations where people have sold the flat before it's finished and made a large profit on it because the property market's going up, and how do people feel about that and people profiting from it and so on. So you sort of need to think all this stuff through before you start, because it'll trip you up otherwise. Using architects is always complicated and is always risky. Something can go wrong. They can dig into the ground and find a gas pipe that you didn't know about, or foundations that don't work, or whatever, and that can cause the cost to go up. So halfway through you end up with an extra £20,000 that you weren't expecting, and then how do you share that out between people, and is there a contingency, and all that sort of thing. So, building anything, as any developer will tell you, is a risky business. It's rewarding, but don't think that it's not going to be risky as well, and you need to be prepared for that.
Any tips in how to avoid those sorts of tensions that you mentioned, or situations that might develop?
Well, I think it's always worth talking through with your group beforehand, the process, and actually talking to people who've done it. Going to find other groups which have done the same sort of thing. There is also a National Self-Build Association, which, even though it's called Self-Build Association, covers custom build as well. They have a very good website. They have lots of advice and stuff on that, which you can look and link to. And find yourself a good architect. Go and see other stuff that they've done. Talk to other clients that they've had. The architect, I hate to big up the architects too much because they get very big-headed when you do that. But nevertheless, the architect is crucial in this process. When you're building something, they are the link between the construction process and yourself as clients. And so that link is crucial. The trust with the architect is crucial. And actually, I think unless you're very self-assured and self-confident, linking it in a larger development with a developer doing something is probably a safer way of it's a way of minimising some of the risks, rather than taking all the risks yourself in terms of finding a site, getting planning permission, which is always in this country a difficult process to go through, and you won't understand why the planners don't like what you want to do, but that will always be difficult. So working with a developer is probably a good way of minimising your risk. But don't go into it if you want a risk-free life, because it will never be as easy as buying flats off the shelf that someone else has built.
What is the uptake of this like? Is it something we'll see more in the coming years, in your opinion?
In the UK, where we're speaking, we're very much hopeful that it will become something quite significant. I mean, it's minuscule at the moment in the UK. I mean, if you look on to the rest of Europe, France, something like half all housing are built other than by developers. That's not all custom build, obviously. There's a whole different way of doing it. Switzerland, it's actually something like 60%. Germany, it's significant numbers. In the UK, I think it's 10% at the moment. So 10% of houses are not built by developers. That's people buying a plot and commissioning their own house on it and so on. Some of them, grand design, beautiful things. Some of them much more mundane in terms of what they are. But 10% in the UK is a very low number compared to the rest of Europe. Most of our housing is built by 10 major house builders. Most of them build exactly the same thing, a simple, brick box with a roof on it. Mentioning no names not to get myself in trouble, but there's not a lot of variety. And so if you want to build a house which is slightly different to what the big house builders will provide, there's a real opportunity in the UK. And certainly people we're talking to are seeing maybe 50, 60 homes built this way this year, rising to 3,000 or 4,000 within 2 or 3 years, and then starting to build up to a level which is comparable to one of the house builders. So, the biggest house builder in the country builds 10,000 homes a year. So if custom build could get up to something around that level, then it would be creating as many homes as our biggest house builder. And it starts to become a significant part of the market. And I think an option that a lot more people will choose if it's available. At the moment, you have to be a bit of a pioneer to do this. But as it becomes more commonplace, it'll become a much more normal way of getting your own house.
Does this have a knock-on effect for more sustainable housing too?
That's a really good question. And the answer is we don't know yet. I was thinking about myself, and if I was doing it, and when I did it with the housing cooperative, we saw it as a way of getting something much more energy efficient. But then when I talked to friends in a similar situation who said, well, would I go for more insulation, or would I take a slightly bigger floor area? Because actually these have become very real trade-offs. Do I want a bigger place or a more sustainable place, or do I want a better kitchen, or do I want to live in a slightly better area? Where do I want to spend my money? And it becomes something which becomes a very real set of discussions, I think, between the people about what you want to spend your money on, because money will always be limited, so you can't have everything that you want. And there's one of the first large custom build schemes in the UK is going to take place in Cornwall. And at the moment, the site is being laid out and marketed and so on. And we're hoping to get some research to work with Sheffield University to follow this through, to find out what people do actually choose, to see whether they choose the green option or whether they go for the larger space standards and so on. And to talk to the custom builders who sign up for that and understand what their motivations are and what drives them and what's interested, what they find interesting about the process. And so, yeah, we don't know yet. I mean, one would hope, I think, that this is a way of creating more green, sustainable housing. But it is entirely, the point about the custom bit is that it is entirely up to the people who initiate the process as to how it is developed.
At least they've got a say in it.
Which is true, yes.
In terms of resources, if people want to find out more about collective custom build websites, books, any suggestions?
Well, the National Self-Build Association is your starting point, really, and they have a very good website which has lots of links to all the schemes happening in the country, so you can talk to other people doing this. As I say, there is also a website which has been produced as part of a research project with Sheffield University by Ashley Cooler Architects, which is also linked to the National Self-Build Association website, but again, that's specifically looking at custom build, group custom build, and looking at examples and manufacturers, and there's a very good video which sort of explains the process, which is worth checking out as well.
Is there any other aspect of this that we should bring in, or is that a fairly good overview?
I think that's a fairly good overview. It's something people should do. I mean, I spent a long time working through, it wasn't called Group Custom Build then, but it probably would be now, the Homes to Change scheme, and it sort of set me on my course for my career, because I realised it was the bit of planning that I really enjoyed and thought was really important. So, it set me going forward. So it's worth doing. It's very fulfilling. It's hard work, but I would definitely encourage people to get involved.
And just one final question. You mentioned right at the beginning of the interview, the German, is it Baugruppen or something like that? Is this the same as that?
But Baugruppen is very similar, yeah. I mean, obviously, as we've discussed, there are variations on all of this process, but the Baugruppen process in Germany is essentially the same as group custom build.
David, thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much.
Find out more about David and Urbed and also the links and resources that he's suggested, plus have a look at some pictures of the development in Almere in our show notes. houseplanninghelp.com/49 is where they're kept for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them at the bottom as well. My one call to action today is for you to help us raise our visibility by writing an iTunes review. Remember, it doesn't have to be an essay, it can be short and sweet, as this one is from Helen XYZ, who says, a great podcast, some top interviews that introduce you to great ideas about how to make your home energy efficient. Well done, Ben. As I say, nice and neat, wasn't it? So if you can do that for us, please help out. Next time, my guest is serial self-builder David Snell, who's on his 14th project. We'll find out why, and we're also going to be talking about putting together a great team. Until then, take care. Cheers.